You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen every kind of selfish decision a person could make behind the wheel. I've seen people run red lights because they were late for dinner. I've seen drivers speed through school zones because they didn't want to be inconvenienced. But the morning I learned that a woman refused to move her car for an ambulance carrying a 12-year-old boy in cardiac arrest, I felt something shift inside me. What I heard in my courtroom that day, what I saw with my own eyes, it reminded me why I still wear this robe. And when I delivered my decision, the silence in that room said more than applause ever could. Let me tell you what happened, because this story isn't just about traffic laws, it's about character. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years. Every morning I walk into my courtroom at 8:15 sharp. Christina, my clerk, has my coffee waiting for me. Strong, black. She knows exactly how I like it. I take that first sip and I look over the calendar for the day. I've done that same routine since 1984. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but hope and a work ethic. He used to tell me, "Frank, your name is all you really own. Guard it." I carry those words with me every time I step onto that bench. I've learned that the law isn't just about rules. It's about respect, respect for each other, respect for life. That particular Wednesday morning felt heavier than most. I remember looking out the window of my chambers before court started. The sky was gray. Not storming, just gray. Sometimes I get a feeling before a case even begins. A quiet sense that something important is about to unfold. My gut was telling me to pay attention that day. I sat down at my bench and adjusted my glasses. I could hear the low hum of conversation in my courtroom. People shifting in their seats, papers rustling. I glanced at the first few files. Minor traffic violations, parking tickets, speeding, the usual. Then I picked up a file that had a small red sticker on the corner. That usually means there's something unusual about the case. I opened it and read the name. The defendant was the wife of a well-known state senator. I recognized the last name immediately. Around here, people know it. It carries weight in certain circles. I don't care about weight in circles. I care about facts. As I read further, I felt my jaw tighten. Failure to yield to an emergency vehicle. Obstructing an ambulance, body camera evidence attached. Dash cam footage included. Officer notes detailed and specific. I remember thinking to myself, people don't understand what those sirens mean. When you hear that sound, it's not background noise. It's not an inconvenience. It's someone's worst day. Christina leaned toward me and whispered, "There's media outside today, Judge." I nodded slowly. That explained the tension in the room. Word travels fast when a politician's family is involved. I've had powerful people stand in front of me before, business owners, public figures, even a few local celebrities. And I treat them all the same way I treat the nurse working a double shift or the mechanic trying to make rent. In my courtroom, titles stay at the door. Still, I won't pretend I didn't understand the pressure. When someone connected to politics sits at that defense table, eyes are watching, not just from the gallery, from offices, from people who think influence should change outcomes. Let me tell you something I've learned in 4 decades. The law doesn't care about your bank account. It doesn't care about your last name. It cares about your actions. As I continued reading the file, the details began to form a picture in my mind. It was 4:17 in the afternoon. Traffic was backed up on Broad Street. An ambulance approached from behind with lights flashing and sirens on. The officer's report stated that most drivers moved aside immediately, except one. The report said the vehicle remained in the lane for approximately 28 seconds. 28 seconds might not sound like much to some people, but in cardiac arrest, 28 seconds can feel like a lifetime. The ambulance was transporting a 12-year-old boy. Cardiac arrest following a sudden collapse at basketball practice. CPR in progress inside the vehicle. I paused right there at my bench. I could almost hear the siren in my head. I imagined the paramedics working frantically. I imagined the boy's mother holding his hand. I imagined that feeling of helplessness. My grandson turned 12 last month. Watching him grow up reminds me why this work matters. When I read that age in the report, it hit me differently. I looked up into the courtroom. The seats were fuller than usual. I saw reporters near the back. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but their presence outside was enough. The air felt tight. Before calling the case, I took a slow sip of coffee. It had gone lukewarm. I didn't mind. I needed that pause. Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever been stuck in traffic and heard an ambulance behind you? Did your heart jump a little? Did you move without thinking? Most of us do. Because we understand that for someone else, that siren means everything. I'm curious what you think. Have you ever seen someone ignore it? Leave me a comment and tell me what you would have felt in that moment. I place the file down gently. I don't slam papers. I don't raise my voice unless I have to. But I could feel a steady weight building in my chest. I remember thinking this case isn't just about a traffic citation. It's about mindset. It's about whether someone believes the rules apply to them. Christina called the case number softly. The courtroom quieted almost instantly. I watched as the defendant stood up from the second row and walked toward the front. Even from my bench, I could see the confidence in her posture. Designer handbag over her shoulder, perfectly styled hair, a tailored suit that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. I don't judge people for what they wear, but I do observe how they carry themselves. She took her place at the defense table beside her attorney. I noticed she didn't look nervous. She looked annoyed. There's a difference. I've seen both expressions thousands of times. As she stood there, I couldn't help but think about the boy in that ambulance. I didn't know yet whether he survived. That detail wasn't in the initial summary, and that uncertainty sat heavy with me. I adjusted my robe slightly and looked directly at her. I always look people in the eye. My father taught me that too. He said, if you can't look someone in the eye, you shouldn't be speaking. I hadn't said a word yet, but I could already feel that this wasn't going to be a routine morning. And deep down, I knew this case was about more than a traffic lane. It was about what we value when no one thinks we're being watched. I looked down at the file again before I spoke. I always do that. I want the facts clear in my mind before I open my mouth. I don't rely on headlines. I don't rely on reputation. I rely on evidence. I said her name calmly and asked her to step forward. She did, slowly, like this was an inconvenience wedged into her afternoon schedule. Her attorney adjusted his tie and gave me a polite nod. I returned it. Courtesy costs nothing. Then I said something simple. I said, "Ma'am, you're charged with failing to yield to an emergency vehicle, specifically an ambulance with lights and sirens activated. Do you understand that charge?" She nodded slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, but I heard a hint of impatience in her voice. Not fear, not concern, just impatience. I've learned to listen to tone as much as words. Before I asked anything else, I turned to the prosecutor and requested a brief summary. I wanted the record clear in open court. The prosecutor stood and explained what happened that afternoon. I listened carefully, my hands folded in front of me. As he spoke, I watched her face. She stared straight ahead, no visible emotion, no reaction. Then the prosecutor said something that made the room shift. He said, "Your Honor, the ambulance was transporting a 12-year-old boy in cardiac arrest. CPR was in progress at the time of the obstruction." The courtroom grew quieter. Even the reporters stopped moving their pens. I felt that weight again in my chest. I said, "I'd like to hear from the responding officer. I always prefer first-hand accounts when possible." The officer stepped forward. He looked steady, professional. I asked him to describe what he saw. He told me traffic was heavy but moving slowly. He said most vehicles pulled to the right as soon as they heard the siren. Then he pointed to the defendant and said, "Her vehicle remained centered in the lane. The ambulance had to slow down." I asked him, "How long would you estimate?" He said, "Approximately 20 to 30 seconds, Your Honor. I checked the dash cam timestamp, 20 to 30 seconds. I repeated that number in my head. I've presided over cases where seconds mattered. Seconds in a collision, seconds in a missed signal, seconds in a decision that changed a life. Then I asked the question that was sitting in my mind. I said, "Officer, could the ambulance have passed safely?" He shook his head slightly. "Not without risk. There was no clear lane. It required the vehicle in front to move." I leaned back in my chair for a moment. I had to pause. Sometimes I do that so people understand the gravity of what's being discussed. Then I asked if the paramedic who was in the ambulance was present. The prosecutor said yes. I nodded and invited him forward. He was young, probably early 30s. He wore his uniform with quiet pride. I could see exhaustion in his eyes, not from that day, but from the job. I've met enough EMTs to recognize that look. They carry things most of us never see. I asked him gently to describe what was happening inside that ambulance. He took a breath before speaking. I watched his hands clasped together. He said, "Your Honor, the patient was 12 years old. He collapsed during basketball practice. When we arrived, he had no pulse. We began CPR immediately. En route to the hospital, we were administering oxygen and preparing defibrillation." As he spoke, I felt my throat tighten slightly. I pictured that boy on a stretcher. I pictured a mother riding along, praying. I've seen mothers in that state before. It's something you never forget. The paramedic continued. "When traffic slowed, we activated our sirens and lights. Most drivers moved right away. One vehicle didn't." I asked him, "What did that delay mean to you in that moment?" He looked at me directly. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He simply said, "Every second matters in cardiac arrest, Your Honor. Brain damage can begin within minutes. When we lose momentum, it feels like we're losing time we can't afford." I remember thinking about my grandson again. I remembered his laugh at his birthday party last week, the way he ran around the yard without a care in the world. I had to steady myself. I'm a judge, but I'm also a grandfather. The paramedic added, "We were doing compressions when the ambulance slowed. It's harder to maintain rhythm when the vehicle isn't moving steadily." That detail struck me. I hadn't even considered that. I've learned something new in my courtroom almost every week for 40 years. That day was no different. I turned my attention back to the defendant. I watched her expression carefully. I was looking for something: concern, regret, shock, anything that suggested she understood the weight of what we were discussing. Her face remained composed, too composed. Let me tell you something I've learned over the years. When someone truly understands the seriousness of their actions, it shows. It shows in their posture, it shows in their breathing, it shows in their eyes. I said to the paramedic, "Did the patient survive?" The room felt frozen, waiting for that answer. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." He regained a pulse shortly before arrival at the hospital. A soft murmur passed through the gallery. I felt a wave of relief move through me. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding my breath until that moment, but relief doesn't erase risk. I thanked the paramedic for his service, and I meant it. I always make sure first responders know I respect what they do. My father taught me that too. He said, "Frank, respect the people who run toward danger." As the paramedic stepped back, I looked at the defendant again. I said, "Ma'am, did you hear the sirens?" She shifted slightly. "I had my windows up, Your Honor. The traffic was loud. I was on a call." I heard the way she said it, matter of fact, as if this was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. I leaned forward slightly. I wanted her to see that I was paying attention. I said, "You were on a call." She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, it was an important call." Important. That word hung in the air. I remember thinking, what could be more important than a child's heartbeat? I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. But it was there in my mind. Let me pause here for a moment. I want you to think about something. Imagine you're in that ambulance. Imagine your child on that stretcher. Imagine hearing the siren slow down because someone ahead won't move. How would that feel? I'm not asking to stir emotion for no reason. I'm asking because perspective matters. If you believe yielding to emergency vehicles is more than just a rule, let me know. Your thoughts matter to me. I straightened in my chair and folded my hands again. The case was just beginning, but I could already feel that this wasn't going to end with a simple fine and a quick dismissal. There was more beneath the surface. I could sense it, and after 40 years, I've learned to trust that instinct. I kept my eyes on her for a moment after she said she was on an important call. I've heard that phrase many times in my courtroom. Important meeting, important client, important schedule. But I've also learned something simple over the years. When a siren goes off behind you, whatever you're doing stops being important. I said to her calmly, "Ma'am, did you at any point notice the lights in your rearview mirror?" She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. I may have seen flashing lights, Your Honor, but traffic was congested. There wasn't much I could do. I've been driving in this city for decades. I know congestion. I also know that when drivers want to move, they find a way, even if it means edging onto a curb or inching into a shoulder. I asked the officer, "Was there space to the right?" He answered clearly, "Yes, Your Honor, enough for her vehicle to shift partially and allow the ambulance to pass." I saw her jaw tighten slightly. That was the first crack in the composure she had been holding. Her attorney stepped forward gently and said, "Your Honor, my client was concerned about safety. There have been security threats in the past due to her husband's public position. She was advised not to make sudden maneuvers in traffic." Security threats. I've heard that word used before as a shield. I leaned back slightly and folded my hands. I remember thinking to myself, this is where the case shifts. This is where justification meets responsibility. I said to her directly, "Ma'am, are you telling this court that you chose not to move because you feared for your safety?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I couldn't just swerve without assessing the situation." I heard a faint sound from the gallery, a quiet exhale. People react even when they try not to. I looked down at the file again. I saw the notation that dashcam audio had been submitted. I said, "I would like the audio from the officer's dashcam played in this courtroom." Christina glanced at me and nodded. Within moments, the small speaker on the clerk's desk came alive. I heard the faint hum of traffic first, then the siren, loud, clear, impossible to miss. It echoed even through the small speaker. Then I heard the officer's voice on the recording. "Move right, move right." The siren continued. Then I heard something else, a female voice from inside the defendant's vehicle, clear enough to understand. "I'm not cutting off that truck. They can go around." The courtroom froze. I felt my fingers pressed together tightly. I didn't interrupt the audio. I let it play, the officer's voice again. "Ma'am, you need to move. That's an ambulance." Her voice responded, slightly sharper this time. "I'm aware. I'm not risking my vehicle." The audio stopped. For a few seconds, no one spoke. I could hear the faint buzz of the courtroom lights above us. I looked directly at her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I said, "Ma'am, did you just hear your own voice on that recording?" She swallowed. It was subtle, but I saw it. "Yes, Your Honor." I leaned forward slightly. "You stated you were assessing the situation. On this recording, you state clearly that you were not willing to risk your vehicle." Her attorney shifted uncomfortably. "I've seen that shift before. It happens when the facts don't cooperate." She spoke again, but this time her tone had changed. It wasn't as polished. I didn't mean it like that, Your Honor. It was chaotic. I was under pressure. Under pressure. I thought about the paramedic doing chest compressions in the back of that ambulance. I thought about a mother watching her son's chest rise and fall unnaturally under mechanical rhythm. That is pressure. I removed my glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose for a moment. Sometimes I do that when I need to steady my thoughts. I said to her, "Ma'am, when you hear a siren, that sound doesn't represent inconvenience. It represents urgency. It represents someone fighting for life." She didn't respond. I continued, "I've learned one thing in 40 years on this bench. The law doesn't ask how expensive your car is. It doesn't ask how important your call was. It asks one simple question: did you yield?" The room was so quiet I could almost hear people breathing. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The confidence she walked in with earlier had softened just slightly. Her attorney spoke again. "Your Honor, the child survived. There was no lasting harm." I turned my head slowly toward him. I've always believed words matter, and that sentence mattered. I said carefully, "Counselor, we do not measure responsibility by outcome alone. We measure it by action." I let that sit for a moment. I remember thinking about something my father once told me. He said, "Frank, you don't wait for tragedy to respect the rules. You respect them so tragedy doesn't happen." I looked back at her. "Ma'am, do you understand that 28 seconds in cardiac arrest can change the course of a life?" Her eyes flickered slightly. For the first time, I saw something that looked close to uncertainty. She said quietly, "I didn't think about it that way." That sentence stayed with me. I didn't think about it that way. Sometimes the most dangerous decisions come from not thinking beyond ourselves. Let me ask you something right here. Have you ever made a choice in the moment that didn't seem serious at first, but later you realized it could have been? That's what we're talking about here. Responsibility isn't always about intention. It's about awareness. I'm curious what you believe matters more, intent or impact. Tell me what you think. I returned my attention to the bench. I wasn't finished yet. I could feel there was more beneath the surface. I said, "Officer, after the vehicle finally moved, did you speak with the driver?" He nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And what was said?" He cleared his throat slightly. "She asked me if I knew who her husband was." There it was. The air in the courtroom shifted again, not loudly, just enough. I looked at her. She looked straight ahead. I asked gently, "Did you make that statement?" She hesitated. "I may have mentioned my husband, Your Honor. It was a stressful situation." Stressful. I leaned back slowly in my chair. I've heard that phrase used to justify many things. I said to her calmly, "Ma'am, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. In my courtroom, a nurse and a senator's spouse stand on exactly the same ground. That's not just tradition, that's principle." I let my words settle in the room. I could see people in the gallery nodding slightly, not in excitement, in recognition. She lowered her eyes for the first time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting, but I was firm. Because this case was no longer just about traffic. It was about something deeper. It was about whether influence becomes a shield, and I had no intention of allowing that shield to exist in my courtroom. I could feel the temperature in my courtroom change after the officer repeated what she had said. When someone asks, "Do you know who my husband is?" it carries a message underneath the words. I've heard that message before. It says, "I don't stand here alone." It says, "I have weight behind me." I looked at her carefully. I've learned that when people are confronted with their own words, they either step back or they double down. I said calmly, "Ma'am, when you mentioned your husband to the officer, what were you hoping would happen?" She hesitated again. I watched her fingers tighten around the strap of her handbag. "I wasn't hoping for anything specific, Your Honor," she said. I was simply identifying myself. Identifying herself. I nodded slowly. And did you believe that identification might influence the officer's decision? Her attorney stepped in quickly. Your Honor, my client was under stress. She felt targeted. Targeted. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't about being targeted. This is about being accountable. I leaned forward slightly. I wanted her to see that I wasn't attacking her. I was asking her to reflect. I said, Ma'am, when you hear an ambulance siren, what do you think that sound means? She blinked, caught slightly off guard by the simplicity of the question. It means there's an emergency, she replied. Yes, I said gently. And what does an emergency mean? She didn't answer immediately. I continued. It means someone's life is in danger. It means time matters. It means every driver on that road shares responsibility. I could hear the quiet in the room growing heavier. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling. I said something then that I don't say lightly. I said, money can buy a lot of things. It can buy comfort. It can buy influence in certain circles. But it cannot buy character. And it cannot buy the right to ignore a siren. I saw her shoulders drop just slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. Her attorney tried again. Your Honor, we are not disputing that a delay occurred. We are simply asking the court to consider that there was no malicious intent. Intent. I presided over cases where intent was everything. And I've presided over cases where intent didn't erase consequence. I said carefully, Counselor, intent does not restart a stopped heart. Intent does not erase risk. The law requires drivers to yield. It does not require them to analyze their mood before doing so. There was a soft sound of agreement from somewhere in the gallery. I didn't look up. I stayed focused.